Episode 4.
Buenos dias, children.
The mayor's in the house. What up? The mayor's in the house. Better throw them hands up. The mayor's in the house. Hear them talking in the streets. The mayor's in the house. Turning over that new leaf.
Welcome to the Super Genius Podcast. I'm here to help you with your AP European History, whether you be in my own class or in classes all over the United States in this great world of ours. I'm here today to talk about Michael de Montaigne. You say, that sounds incredibly boring. I want to turn off. I'll tell you, no. Because Michael de Montaigne writes an essay about cannibals. And I think you can learn a lot about Michael de Montaigne and cannibals from that essay. So I think you should definitely listen to that. Also, we're going to answer a couple of questions here at the top about various holiday type stuff. And let's get started. Question comes from Twitter. Question is, what is the 12 days of Christmas and why is it so annoying? I cannot answer that question. It is annoying because it is repetitious, but some people actually like it. So to you it might not be annoying. But what I can tell you is the 12 days of Christmas, I think that's what you're really asking, is the 12 days that go from Christmas until early January. According to Christian tradition, the Christmas would be the birth of Christ, whereas it would go all the way up to January 6th, I believe, which is Epiphany. And on Epiphany, that is when the wise men visited, and it was proclaimed that Christ had been born. That is at least the tradition. Some people have spread a rumor that it is actually a secret Catholic code. We've talked a bit about that in my class, at least, where we've talked about how the English were not especially friendly to our friends the Catholics, and that perhaps this was a way, some people say, for Catholics to teach each other and young people about the Catholic tradition. I can tell you this seems to be nonsense. There's not very good evidence for it, and most people, Catholics and Protestants alike, think it is just an annoying song. So, sorry. If you like it, though, it's good for you. Alright, enough of that nonsense. Let's talk about Michael de Montaigne. Michael de Montaigne shows up in chapter 15 of Mackay. I can't speak to other books because they're over there on the shelf, and I'm not going to walk over and get them because it seems like a lot of work. So, I'll just talk about Mackay. Mackay talks about Michael Montaigne, talks about the essay. It wasn't like Montaigne came up with the concept of writing words. Clearly, we've had this for a long time. What Montaigne does, though, is popularize the essay, wherein he picks a subject, writes about his feelings, adds a healthy dose of skepticism, something we'd seen back in the Renaissance, critical analysis, but also, as you're going to see with this talk about cannibals, a bit of cultural relativism, critique of current trends, for lack of a better word, and other stuff, which makes this pretty importante. So let's talk about Michael de Montaigne of Cannibals. If you're interested, it's a relatively short essay. You can pick it up off the internet on Google. It was written in the 1500s. So he writes about, starting in the essay, about how cannibals are, by and large, pretty healthy. He says, it is rare to hear of a sick person, and they moreover assure me that they never saw any of the natives, or people who saw them, never saw any of the natives that were paralyzed, had bad teeth, were blind, or crippled, or anything like that. So he starts off very pro-cannibal. And it's not necessarily that he is pro-cannibal, as we're going to see, but more he's describing it with what we would say in anthropology nowadays, study of man, study of culture, as kind of a, like, hey, you know what, let's look at these guys, let's see what they're doing, and let's not judge them. Let's just first analyze them. So, he talks about how they go to war all the time. And this is like paragraph 2, by the way. This gets awesome fast. And he talks about how they go to war, and I will quote at this point, each one, for a trophy, brings home the head of an enemy he has killed, which he fixes over the door of his house. So clearly they're interested in decorating. And then he talks about they treat them very well. And after he has basically done everything he can for his prisoner. This is after the warfare. You know, he's got his prisoner at home. Some of them he decapitated, put him above the house. We've all been there. Then he starts treating him, you know, nicely. Hey, you're my prisoner, but I'm going to treat you nice. And after a while, he says, okay, look, I've done all I can do for you as a prisoner. Time to have a party. Invites all his friends over. And let me start quoting now. His friends, they being come, he ties a rope to one of the arms of the prisoner, which, at a distance, out of his reach, he holds the one end himself, and he gives the other to the friend he loves best. So his best friend, his BFF. This is sweet. The other best friend there holds the other arm. And then they too, in the presence of all, dispatch him with their swords, which is a nice way of saying they kill him. Then, after that, they roast him, eat him, and send some chops to their absent friends. They do not do this, as some think, for nourishment, but as a representation of an extreme revenge. So, he starts off saying, like, okay, look, this is what they do. It's kind of gory. He doesn't go into the nasty parts. He doesn't get into blood and guts or anything. But, you know, it's fairly graphic for something you get to read in AP Euro. Then, he says something very interesting. He says that they have observed the Portuguese, because the Portuguese, Portugal, had been also involved in the Age of Exploration, and apparently had allied with this group of cannibals. And I'm not sure if I'm reading a truncated version or what, but it doesn't say exactly where these cannibals are located, so I'll just go with me here. And the cannibals, their enemies, were with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese would put their prisoners up to the sand. They'd put them in sand up to the girdle, so that's like mid torso, and then shoot at them with arrows until their corpse was stuck full of arrows. And the cannibals started doing this as well because they thought that, let me read this, as being men who had sown the knowledge of a great many vices among their neighbors, that's the Portuguese, and were greater masters in mischief than they should also adopt it. But the cannibals, Montaigne makes a point of noting, did not exercise this sort of revenge without a meaning, and it what didn't necessarily need to be more painful. So why is he saying all this? You're like, okay, so cannibals, why do I care? Well, he says it because then he goes on and says, we may then call these people barbarians, in other words, in respect to the rules of reason, but not in respect to ourselves, who in all sorts of barbarity exceed them. Their wars are throughout noble and generous, and carry with them as much excuse and fair pretense as humans are capable of. If he says, hey, Europeans, look in the mirror, bro, we ain't so good. Matter of fact, we're just as bad in our own way. And he talks about a bunch of terrible things that have happened during the wars of religion. And really he comes out of it and he says, in plain truth, these men are either very savage in comparison to us. They must absolutely be so, or else we are savages, for there is a vast difference between their manners and ours. He's very much saying, hey, where do we get off criticizing these people when we are so savage ourselves? This is cultural relativism, the idea that our culture, and in this Montaigne is clearly European, being a Frenchie, he says, hey, I can't judge these guys. It seems weird to me that they eat people, but they seem to do it for a good reason, at least in their minds, whereas we do things terribly and we torture people far beyond what we need to do. And that is for what purpose exactly? So he's kind of saying, you know, don't judge him. Then he tells some interesting stories. First he goes on for longer than he needs to about how they have several wives. They're not cats, they don't have several lives. How they have several wives, and so much the greater number by which they have the greater reputation for valor. So the more wives they have, the better. The more respect they get. And he says how they're really cool and their wives are so awesome because they're cool with them having multiple wives, which I think is really just him kind of living out his inner Tiger Woods. But then he says a story about how some of them visited Europe and went to visit Charles the Ninth of Sweden, I believe. Yeah. And they asked him, later on, they asked some of the men around, they said, like, hey, how come you guys follow a child because he was a very young child at the time. And this is a good point about monarchy. If you have a monarchy that goes from father to son, there are some weird examples where you end up with very young kings. Louis XIV springs to mind, but we've certainly had other child kings. Why do we put up with them? Secondly, and this is very pointed here, he says, how is it that half of the men are begging at the doors, lean and starved with hunger and poverty, and they suffer such a great inequality and injustice, and do not take the ones who have by the throats or set fire to their houses? In other words, he's talking about classes there. This is straight out of Karl Marx, who we'll talk about on a different podcast, where, how come you guys are putting up with having people who are so poor, and they just kind of go with it? What makes you, how do you keep them in control exactly? Why do they do that? He's kind of implying that, these are strange things to them. They don't have these problems. So we being the Europeans, because that's his audience, must be the weird ones. Kind of interesting. He's making a little satire there, poking a little fun. Then at the end he says, not all bad, speaking of the cannibals, not all bad that, but they wear no breeches. So he says, basically, they seem okay to me, but they don't wear pants. So kind of a at the end, which is, joke. But he's still kind of saying, like, hey, when it comes down to it, we probably treat these people bad, but we do it because they are not civilized according to our silly, silly things.
All right, sorry for the long episode this week. Hopefully you enjoyed all the cannibal talk. You can always tweet me on the Twitter at Oliver Euro, or if you prefer, you can visit me at my website, www.bullardoliver.com, or on my Tumblr at olivereuro.tumblr.com. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Shaking trees, yo, picking fruit too. Tell me what the mayor's supposed to do. Buying furniture, catching mad fish. That ain't a fish, that's just an old boot, dude. Really though, gonna go recycle it and fish some more. Gonna